I started defending doctors, hospitals, nurses in medical malpractice cases when I was still in law school. I can't tell you how many times there have been misunderstandings because providers use words that patients don't understand. My dream is to have doctors and patients communicating so well that we're preventing a lot of these lawsuits. And it's like, well, you should give me this because I'm really good and I've worked hard and I want to buy a house. And I'm like, who cares? They don't care. How does what you do impact their life, solve their problem, ease their pain? Because that's how you win.
I feel like you know a lot more about me than I know about you right now.
That might be true. That might be true.
On this episode, I'm joined by Heather Hansen. Heather spent over 20 years as a trial attorney, defending doctors and hospitals by persuading juries to see her clients' perspectives. She has since transformed this expertise, along with her psychology degree, conflict resolution training, and experience as a TV host, into a powerful advocacy curriculum. Heather has worked with top organizations like Google, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, and the American Medical Association, as well as lectured at Harvard Business School, Stanford Law School, and the University of Pennsylvania. Drawing on her diverse background, Heather developed the 5 C's of an advocate, a set of tools designed to help you overcome objections, build credibility, and change minds. I'm delighted to have Heather here today to share her insight on mastering the art of advocacy. Heather, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh my gosh, Nima, I'm so excited to be here. I love your podcast. You have such great conversations, and I'm excited to have one with you.
Thank you so much. Actually, on that point, I want to start. I've watched other podcasts that you are on, and it seems like, as a host, I feel like I have to do my homework to have you on. But it seems like you, as the guest, also do your homework on who you're on, because you're the first person to ever actually reply back. Be like, I've watched some of your episodes. I would love to be on. And I see you do that with other people also, because you bring up like points they talked about in a previous podcast. I'm like, wow, she really did her homework. Can you speak to me on the importance? I'm like, what does that mean to you, and why do you do that?
So I think, well, there's a couple things. Preparation as a trial attorney, I had to be prepared. There's only so many things you can control in the courtroom. And one of the things you can control is being the most prepared person in the room. Everything else could go crazy, but that's one of the things you could control. And then that lent itself to the most important thing, which is credibility. If I come on and I don't know who you are or what you talk about or what you've done, there is something that will be said in the next hour that will reflect that. And I might lose your credibility a little. I might lose the listeners, the watchers, the audience's credibility a little. And I can't afford to lose credibility. So as best I can, the last thing I will say is I feel like it's a show of love and respect. If you have taken it upon yourself to reach out to me and to ask me to be on your podcast, it is my way of showing you that I respect you, to listen to the podcast, to be aware of what you do here so that I can make it the best it can be. I do the same thing. I have a podcast, The Elegant Warrior, and if I have an author on, I read their book before I have them on, and I'm shocked at how many people say other podcast hosts don't read my book.
Yeah.
So for me, it's all of those things. It's preparation, it's credibility, and it's respect.
Yeah, it's like, I feel like you don't take the easy way out, because a lot of people could be like, hey, what questions are you going to talk about? What are you going to answer? You're like, instead of me asking, I'm just going to go find out myself.
Well, right. I think that's, and also just your style and how, there's so much that you can get from doing the research yourself as opposed to asking the other person,
I feel like you sit there and investigate, like body language, like you've talked about, the tone of voice and everything. And I feel like you know a lot more about me than I know about you right now.
That might be true. That might be true.
So one thing I was really interested about when I saw that you were an attorney, there's a lot of people suing people nowadays, and they've been happening all throughout the years, right? What makes a court case go viral? Like, is it planned for it to go viral? How does it? Do the people have to agree? That the teams have to agree? Like, hey, yes, we're okay with this being viral, televised. How does that work?
So it's a great question. My work was mostly civil, not criminal, but the TV work I do, I'm a host at the Law and Crime Network. That's criminal. I'll speak to that because those cases are much more likely to go viral. I think that if they have really interesting facts, people are interested in that. If people think, like right now, as we record this, there's a case in the news. It's a woman named Karen Reed in Massachusetts who's accused of killing her boyfriend, who was a police officer. There's a lot in that case that is confusing. And so very similar to, there used to be a podcast called Serial that was about a murder and that the defendant ended up getting out of jail as a result of that podcast. I think people want to do research, do discovery, come up with their own opinions, maybe attack the other side. People love to have an enemy. And so I think there are some cases that feed on that allow for that. There's also a certain segment of the population, and no shade if this is you, who just love really scary cases. That's not me. And when we cover those cases, I'm sort of like, how do I get this out of my energy when I leave? But I think that there's a certain segment of the population that, whether it's research shows that it's because it helps them with anxiety to think that they can figure out how to avoid being in those situations that they could be hurt. But there's some people who just like to hear those scary cases. But at the bottom line, just like a lot of what we're talking about today, it's story.
Yeah.
If there's a really good story, people are drawn to it.
Yeah. And unfortunately, society loves the negatives, and most unfortunately, in the lawyer field, in the trials and everything, there's nothing really positive. At some point, some part of it is going to be negative for one party. So people feed off a negative.
Absolutely. And the truth is it's negative for both parties. There's studies that show that the litigation going through the trial is actually more psychologically harmful than the underlying event. So whether that's, in my cases, it was medical malpractice, or whether it's, some even car accidents. But trials are very stressful, no matter whether you're the one who brought the case or you're the one defending the case. And so it's really something, people don't believe me, but you really want to avoid it at all costs.
Talk about avoiding it. Like, is it ever been a point where, like, the trial just didn't end up going as far as you thought, and people were just like, you know what, I'm over this. Let's just settle in a way, I guess.
That, to be perfectly honest, is most likely to happen before the lawyers get involved.
Yeah.
Because lawyers, so the way that it works, one side, the side in general, in civil cases like mine, I'll speak to my cases. I defended doctors in medical malpractice cases. So if you went to the doctor and the doctor made a mistake, which does happen, and you had injuries, which unfortunately does happen, you might decide to sue. Now, if you were to just reach out to the doctor and say, look, I have these injuries, it's going to cost me money, I can't go back to work, and the doctor was to say, you know what, we'll pay you X amount of dollars, then that could just go away. And I think that is so much more likely to happen before the insurance companies on my side and the attorneys on the other side. Because the attorneys on the other side, they get a third of the money that they get. They don't get a third of nothing. They don't get a third of like an amount that's reasonable for both sides. And so once the attorneys are involved and once the insurance companies are weighing, is this case worth what they want? All of a sudden, it's not the people who were actually in relationship. It's all these other people who are, their jobs are just to think about the dollars.
And it's funny you say that. Don't you think like it would be also a great idea to start giving what you do as on the side, the advocating part, have patients kind of advocate for themselves, to do that with doctors so they don't get to the courtroom? They can teach them how to communicate with doctors and to kind of get what they want.
Absolutely. And that is really, really important to even before a lawsuit happens. My dream is to have doctors and patients communicating so well that we're preventing a lot of these lawsuits. Because first of all, if a doctor and a patient is the most important member of a healthcare team. I love doctors, but sometimes they think they're the most important member of a healthcare team. And they're not. If the patient doesn't do PT, wash the area with iodine before surgery, stop smoking, the surgery, the treatment, the medicine is not going to do any good. And so the patient really is the most important person. That means they can give information to the doctor that the doctor wouldn't otherwise know. They often know things about their symptoms. And so if we can get doctors and patients speaking, really communicating, not just sort of talking at each other and listening, then fewer lawsuits will happen. In addition, there's research out of both the the New England Journal of Medicine and Harvard that says that lawsuits are not really well correlated with negligence, which means if a doctor makes a mistake, which they do, they're human, those are less likely to lead to lawsuits than when a doctor doesn't communicate well with a patient, doesn't explain things well. And so you're absolutely right. If we can get doctors and patients advocating, I would prefer they advocate rather than communicate. We could talk about the difference way earlier, then we're going to have healthier patients, healthier doctors, healthier healthcare teams, and fewer lawsuits.
So do you feel like, as a pharmacist, I'm a practicing pharmacist in Florida, as we mentioned before, I feel like a lot of times for our profession, the patients don't really understand what we do and what we provide for them, and I feel they're a lot of times feel obligated. Do you see that also with physicians where you feel like the patient's a lot obligated and it's like kind of like, does the doctor have to like kind of give it up, or do you try to convince the patient of like what the doctor is going through and what the doctor does on a daily? Because when I see a patient come into my pharmacy and they just want their like medication like right away, I'm like, well, it's a process. Like, do you want your medication the right way, or do you just want your medication and have it possibly be wrong?
Yeah, it's such a good point. So I had on my podcast, I had a doctor, Stephen Treziak is his name. It's Treziak. I think I'm spelling that correctly. And he had written a book called Compassionomics. And it's about the ROI of compassion in medicine. It's all based on peer-reviewed studies, big fat book. But it's all about providers providing compassion to patients. And in our conversations, I asked him, what about doctors asking patients for compassion? Because doctors and pharmacists, nurses, everyone in the healthcare, they're burnt out. They're working unbelievable hours. We just talked about how the holiday is Monday and you're not having a holiday. And so to have a doctor say to a patient, listen, I am back to back. I had a patient earlier today who is very, very sick. It's a patient I'm close to. I'm having a really hard day. I'm very sad about that. Like, just being human. The doctors that I bring that up to, their eyes get all big, like, no way could I ever ask for compassion. And I think that is something that we need to recognize. Patients need to recognize that you as a pharmacist, you're busy. You don't want to make any mistakes. You have a huge weight on your shoulders. And I'm going to challenge you, Nima, that part of the role is for you to say to patients, especially as a pharmacist, we go in and we're just like, give me my drug, get me out of here. No, I don't need the instructions. For you to say, my job is an important part of you being healthy. And this is something you should know about this medication. Do you have any questions? I know you have this condition. What else? What am I missing? Like, really sort of asking for it instead of just wishing that you got it.
So many times when patients come and you catch something that was wrong, or you ask them like, do you really need to be on this medication? I saw this lab, this and that. And they go back to the doctor, and the doctor was like, oh my God, yeah, I didn't see that. I didn't notice that. They come back. And from that point on, they never rush anything. They come back and like, thank you so much. And I unfortunately don't want to see every patient to go through that, to recognize the value that comes in like the pharmacist taking their time, or a doctor or nurse.
Yep. Yeah. And I think you just ask them, can we slow it down for a minute? It's really important to me that you understand what this medication is doing inside of your body. Because we're a little bit of a drug culture right now where we just take the pill and expect to feel better. But every pill has an interaction with every human and the other things. And it's not just other pills. It's, I think most of the audience will know antibiotics and alcohol, for example. Things interact. And so a pharmacist like you has such an important job that's very often overlooked.
In the past, however long we've been talking about, you've kind of brought up some medical stuff here and there. It seems like you're knowledgeable about it. Before going into representing doctors, before you go into representing a case where obviously there's medical terminology involved, there's going to be conversation. I'm sure, as you've done your homework on this podcast, which is way less important than going to a case, I'm sure you do your research into the terminology, into the background. Like, how does that work?
Oh my goodness. So just so that the audience knows, I started defending doctors, hospitals, nurses in medical malpractice cases when I was still in law school. I started working at the firm that I just left in January, and I'm 51 years old. So I was at that firm for 30 years. And so over those years, yes, my brother makes fun of me because he says, I think I'm a doctor, and I do. But when I started, and this is going to show my age, one of the gifts I got on my first day was a medical dictionary called Bader's, I think is the name of the brand. But it was a big green dictionary. Because then when I would be on the phone with a doctor and he'd start talking about a trochanteric wire, he didn't know because it wasn't Zoom. I'd be furiously flipping through the dictionary to try to figure out what he was saying. And then over the years, it wasn't just dictionaries, it was peer-reviewed studies. It was reading books on how to read fetal monitoring strips. It was going in and watching doctors do knee replacements and hip replacements so that I had some understanding. So yes, and in fact, other lawyers look at this differently. But I always felt like I knew more about the medicine than the law in my case, because the law stays the same. The law doesn't change but for me to learn the medicine, every case was different. And until I got in, really had done quite a bit. And then I did a lot of orthopedics and a lot of baby deliveries. And so you start to learn that. But yes, I had to learn medicine. And it was even before we would Google things. It was a lot of reading books in the library about the surgeries or the treatment that we were defending.
Now you could just put whatever procedure is in ChatGPT and it'll tell you what it is in 30 seconds.
Without a doubt. But then you got to kind of make sure that you're getting it right because medicine changes, and the standard of care changes.
After doing all that homework that you did over the years, did it ever cross your mind, maybe I go to medical school since I'm doing all this work anyways?
No, it kind of went the other way. So when I was younger, I thought maybe I wanted to be a doctor. I was never really good at math and science. I was much more verbal. And so ultimately, I really didn't want to be a lawyer either. I wanted to be a psychologist or I wanted to be a journalist. But I fell into doing the medical malpractice defense. There's no other kind of law I would have wanted to do. Not only because learning the medicine was so interesting, but also because the relationships, the people touched each other. In a car accident, they don't know each other. A big pharma company, like the pharma company doesn't know the patients. The only other area of the law where the two people touch each other is divorce law, which is I never wanted to do that because it's very contentious. These are contentious too. But the relationships there were interesting to me. And I thought the cases were super interesting. I have a knee, so learning about knees. I have, a brain, so learning about the brain. It was the perfect fit for me for a very long time until it wasn't.
Diving into like the world of law, you mentioned divorce. I feel like divorce lawyers gain from the arguments that the two partners have and the more disagreements. So they can go in with not being so far off they're on the same page. Okay, we don't want to be each other, whatever. They get the lawyers, and the lawyers in the background might start spicing things up and cause these two people to clash even more and be like, oh, I wanted 500,000. Now I want 1 million because my lawyer told me that I deserve more. Is that the case also with any lawyer, or is that obviously more seen with the divorce lawyers since they get more gain out of the disagreements?
I think that lawyers would tell you that they don't do that on purpose, first of all.
Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, we all tell ourselves stories to get through our days, right? And so you start to believe your story. Everyone does. We all believe our stories all day long. I mean, that's a big part of the work I do now. Like, what story are you telling yourself, and is it serving you? But so I do think it's true that they would say, I'm serving my client. I'm getting the best result for my client. I'm making sure that my client is whole. I'm making sure that in divorce, for example, I'm making sure that 2 years from now, they're not looking back and saying, I wish I had gotten everything that I was entitled to at the time. And I do think that happens across the board. Currently, I do a lot of sort of coaching and background work for some health practices. And one of them, I met with them for 2 days yesterday. We were doing values and we were doing some mission statement stuff and we were doing some conflict resolution stuff. And right now there's a negotiation going on. And the doctor who's in the negotiation, every time he talks to his lawyer, he comes back with more demands. Well, that's the lawyer's job, right? The lawyer's job is to say to you, especially, and this is another reason why I don't do it anymore, our job is to look for the risk. And so you spend your life looking for the risk. and it becomes all that you see. What you look for is what you see. One of my favorite things to talk about is some people say, I'll believe it when I see it, but you really have to see it first and then you believe it. And so they see, it's the other way around. You have to believe it first and then you will see it. They believe that there's risk. They believe that there's more. They believe that they have a job to do. And so that is all that they see. And so I think that it's not on purpose, but yes, I think it's a lawyer's inclination to be looking for risk, or also the risk, remember, especially if you're on the other side, not the side I'm on, you represent people who are okay with suing.
Yeah.
And so part of the thing is like, are they going to sue me next? And so there's always like, I have to protect myself. I have to say all the things. I have to tell them all the risks. It's sort of how we're trained.
Before prepping for this, I looked up I was curious to see what was the biggest high profile medical malpractice case. And I found Maya Kowalski. I'm sure you might be familiar with it.
I'm not familiar.
Actually, they made a Netflix show on it last year, and the family sued Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital for $220 million, and they won. My question is, does a case like that, how does that differentiate from a $20,000 case? Is it, do you go into it with the same mindset, the same way of you attacking things, or it's like a lot more of like, let's see where we're going to start?
So it's very different because a case like that. So first of all, one of the things I used to do a lot of speaking to doctors. And one of the things that I would tell them is a patient's attorney that I talked to, he said to me, when I look at cases, I don't look for negligence, which means that someone made a mistake. I look for damages, which is how bad are they hurt? Because I'm a good lawyer, I can create liability. What he's saying is, if a person is catastrophically injured, like in that case, I'm sure, probably involved the child. You said it was a children's case, right? When we have brain damaged baby cases, which are terrible and tragic, those cases are worth so much more than someone who breaks their arm and it's reset improperly and they can't fully use their arm, right? Because the damages, the amount of medical care that child's going to need, they're going to need a ramp to go into their house. They're going to need a nurse to sleep there at night. They're going to need physical therapy, occupational therapy, audio therapy, like so much care. Every bit of that is another dollar. And so in the patient's attorney in my jurisdiction, everything's different, gets a third of that number, right? So, but also think about that. You need, if it's an arm case for experts, you need an arm setting expert, whether it was an orthopedic surgeon or an emergency room doctor who set the arm. You might need someone to say, like a physical medicine doctor or a physical therapist, to say how much they can actually move their arm. In the child case, you need a pediatric neurologist about the brain, how's it working, a radiologist to read the studies. You need, if there was a delivery case, you need an OBGYN, but also a neonatologist. Those cases are just huge to work up. And from my perspective, defense attorneys, and again, this is general, every jurisdiction is a little different, but defense attorneys are paid by the hour by the insurance company. So they work up the case. On the patient side, there's a huge risk for the attorney because if they lose, they get nothing. And they still have to put the money in to get every one of those experts and pay every one of those experts. So it's a very different endeavor if it is a $20,000 cases. We don't really see very many of those. Or what we're talking about with this 220. The other thing that I'll add, it's funny because I don't do this work anymore, so like it all pops back into my head. But I stopped in January. The other thing that I'll add though is that when you said they sued for 220, that's not exactly how it works, and I think it's important for people to understand it. When you sue, you say it's and again jurisdiction dependent, but it's more than say $50,000. Less than $50,000, it goes to arbitration first. But more than $50,000, the jury decides the number. Now, They are suggested numbers by both sides. You'll have another expert come in and say, this is how much it's going to cost to get a ramp to the house. This is how much it's going to cost to get an elevator. And then the other side will say, we found a cheaper elevator. They don't really need the elevator. We can get one of those things that boost people up the stairs. And it becomes this battle of experts. So the jury decides how much, and then also, I mean, everybody in the audience can think about this. What's the value of pain and suffering? That's something every juror in these cases has to decide, and it's a very hard thing to do. So that number was probably driven by a couple of things: a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of need for that child, and maybe oftentimes big verdicts is somebody was mad at somebody and wanted to show them, the jury was mad at somebody and wanted to show them by awarding a high number.
How do you put a price tag on pain and suffering?
That's the question. That's the question of these cases. And it's also, I don't want to take away from cases like that, right? In cases like that, and a lot of times it's just they need the money to, but we all have pain and suffering.
But 220 million? Like you said, like I don't want to, dumb down the case or what the family went through or whatever it might be. But I mean, $220 million that you and your kids are probably like sad.
Well, and that's why, again, I don't know that case, but I've seen verdicts of 50 million, and it's a similar thing, right? But it's usually in those cases the jury wants to punish someone. It's not just to make someone whole, because you can't make pain and suffering whole. There's another part that the jury's instructed on about embarrassment. What's the monetary value of being embarrassed? And by embarrassment, sometimes there's people who have a limp, and that they consider that embarrassing, or they don't do well in school, and that can be, embarrassment is one of the worst emotions for the human brain. So it's a terrible thing that someone has an embarrassment for the rest of their lives because of something that happened in a hospital. And of course, they should be compensated for that if someone did something wrong. But what's the right compensation? You have to trust a jury to figure that out.
Talking about the jury, who I guess picks the jury? Is it the judge that like appoints them, or because I know it's neither side, but like how do they come about?
No, we pick it together.
You guys pick it. Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it's a whole process. So I have my psychology degree, and I love jury selection because the psychology of each juror, right? And back in the day, this doesn't happen as much. It does happen sometimes. And again, I stopped doing this work. I just want to be clear on that.
Yes.
As anyone listening is like, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. I stopped doing this work. But the jury, they used to bring books in because they'd be waiting around. And there was before the days of phones that could keep us occupied all the time. And so just noticing what people are reading. If they're reading a legal thriller, they might want to get on the jury because they're interested in like the legalities in the case, right? If they're reading a medical book, then I might want them on the jury, but maybe not. And so during the process, and it's a longer process than we probably want to get into, but they fill out a questionnaire, so we have a sense of them. They answer questions like, would you be more likely to believe a police officer than not? That's more for criminal cases, but we still get that answer, and it still informs what kind of person this is. If they say, I'm more likely to believe a police officer than someone who's not a police officer, or vice versa, right? You start to make assumptions about people based on their answers. And then we take them back to a room and we interview them individually, not in front of the other jurors. In my jurisdiction, there's other jurisdictions that do this differently. And you ask questions like, have you ever had a bad experience at a hospital? Have you ever been angry at your doctor? Do you have doctors in your family? Are you a doctor? All of these things. And then sometimes both sides will agree, this person can't be fair. This person, like a lot of times the other side will argue any doctor has to be stricken. And usually the judge will agree with that. I will fight that though. I will say that doctor said he could be fair. She could be fair. And we have to believe them. They haven't given us any reason not to. But most of the time, in fact, never in any of my cases did I have a doctor on my jury. So the judge would say, we can't have a doctor, strike that person. And then we're left with a pool that we as individuals get to then strike. Strike means get rid of somebody. And you can do that based on all kinds of things. You can't do it based on race, ethnicity, or any of those things. If you do, there's a lot of Supreme Court constitutional law about that. And if you think the other side has done that, you can actually challenge them and say, why did you strike that person?
Yeah.
And so that can get into it. But you go back and forth. I strike one, they strike one, I strike one, they strike one, and then we're left with the jury.
Was there a jury that you remember selecting but you weren't so confident on which way they'll go on. And then because of your skills of like the advocating, and I mentioned like changing minds in the intro, that you took those skills that you had and you were like, oh my God, I did not think this person was going to flip.
Well, I will say this. Every one of my juries was made up of patients, not
Okay.
doctors. Never a doctor.
Oh, so that's that's already going against you.
So I feel very confident in saying that I did that with every single jury. Now, there are some jurors who came in a little bit more empathetic with doctors. Sometimes we'd have people who have doctors in their family. Sometimes we'd have people who had dated doctors or whatever, or nurses, not just doctors, nurses. Sometimes we would have nurses on the jury. So I feel like I was changing minds all the time. And then on top of that, there were often times when I would have a jury. The main thing for me was if you had a jury of people who did not have a high school education, which no problem, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's a little bit harder to explain complicated medical terms if someone hasn't even been through biology. And so that sometimes I would look at a jury, if the entire jury was sort of that kind of an educational background, I would know that I really had to see the world from their perspective. And I had to be really good at speaking to them on their terms. And so, yes, there's plenty of times that I thought this jury, and one of our jobs in the defense side is you have to report back to the insurance company and do something that's impossible and say, I think we're going to win, or I think we're going to lose. And so one of the things you report back and you say, we have a jury of all patients, no one with any medical background. 2 of them hate doctors, but the judge said that they still could stay on the case. And so you definitely see that. But my job was to change minds and to build belief. And so many, many times I still won when I had a jury like that.
Being a lawyer throughout most of your career, at what point did you realize that there's a need for what you're doing now for the people you used to represent?
So very early, I recognized that doctors needed to be taught, providers needed to be taught how to communicate. I think that, and it's not their fault. There's actually research that shows that residents, when they begin, they have a more of a patient's brain. And by the time that they end their training, they have a doctor's brain. And that makes sense, of course. But the more that they can remember to have a patient's brain, the better they're going to be at communicating with patients and seeing things from a patient's perspective and explaining things to them. And I think what happened is, I know what happened, is when I would take a doctor, nurse, tech through a trial, I taught them how to see the case from the jury's perspective. Like, okay, that's what you're saying. How can we explain that to them? What's an analogy? How can we compare this to driving a car, or washing dishes, or making a birdhouse? Something that other people can see. What's an analogy we can use? What's a story we can tell? And they started to see the value. They would actually go back and they would have better patient satisfaction scores because now they knew how to talk to people and how to advocate for their ideas, their choices. And so that happened pretty early on. And I think I was a little bit different in that respect because of my psychology degree and because I'm a woman and not that many women are in this field. And then I recognized that it applied for everyone, not just doctors. And now I do this work with medical professionals, yes, but I do it with anyone who is invested in learning how to change minds and build belief.
What's that one skill that you taught a physician that when they went back to their career, that skill just made them way more successful in what they were doing?
It's perspective taking, which is a form of empathy. So when we talk about empathy, it's sort of fluffy. And I think that people think of it as feeling what other people feel. Mm-hmm. And that's a form of empathy. It's what's called effective empathy. It's not effective for me in the courtroom. I mean, think about it, Nima. If I feel the doctor's anger, impatience, anxiety, fear, frustration, that's not going to make me more effective. And it's not effective in healthcare. If doctors feel or nurses feel their patients' pain, anxiety, fear, sadness, that's not going to help them either. But the other form of empathy is what I teach and what I taught. And it's the skill that if you can master this skill, it will change your life and make you collect so many more wins. And that's just seeing things from a different perspective. When we get off today, I'm coaching someone who's in a little bit of a conflict with one of her employees. And one of the exercises we're going to do, because I met with the employee last night, one of the exercises we're going to do is for her to see the situation from the employee's perspective and tell me that story. And really tell me the story. Not just like, oh yeah, she's probably mad. No, but what does she see? What does she feel? And then you can go to what she's feeling. But like when she comes into work and this thing is going on, what does she see? What is she thinking? How is that impacting her? What's the story she's telling herself? And when I can get my client today to do that, it's going to make the relationship better, guaranteed. So for doctors, it's what is the patient seeing? What do they see? When you come rushing into the room and you don't make eye contact, or just even saying things like, well, the test was negative. Well, negative to me is bad, right? So like the test was negative for any problem, or this is good news, all of your tests were negative. I can't tell you how many times there have been misunderstandings because providers use words that patients don't understand. And so if you can see the words you use through the other person's perspective, you are going to be so much more likely to change their perspective when you have to.
Why is it so hard for humans to do this? Like, I feel like a lot of I talk to a lot of leaders, and there's a common ground on like certain people when they like to speak, and it's like, yeah, we're supposed to do this. We know that, you're not supposed to run a red light. You're not supposed to do this. We all know this, but we still end up doing it. It's like the light is turning yellow. Slow down. Don't speed up. But you still speed up. Like, yeah. Why?
Well, I don't know about the yellow light, but I do know the brain science. And it's evolutionary. We were rewarded back in the day, if we were not in power, to see things from the position of the person in power. So we find, and there's research that backs this up, people who aren't in power, notoriously like women, for example, are better at seeing things from others' perspectives because they have to please the other person. There's also a lot of research that shows the more powerful we get, the worse we get at this, because that's no longer necessary. We don't need to see things from the people who work for us, their position, because it doesn't matter for our safety, for our survival. And so part of it is just brain. It's also our brains are wired to look for threats. And so if we're looking for threats, a person in power doesn't see the people below them, and I'm putting that in quotes for anyone who's just listening, as a threat. And so part of this is overcoming our brains to lean towards love, trust, connection, rather than hatred, distrust, separation.
Do you think you're doing more psychology work now than or even throughout your whole career? Do you think you did more psychology work than law work?
Yeah. So the work I do now, definitely. I mean, I'm not, I'm not doing any legal work. I have a client who now wants me to do some. So we're talking about what that would look like. But I am doing very little legal work, if any. My work now is completely psychology. It is persuasion. It is building credibility. I'm getting certified as a hypnotherapist, talking to the subconscious mind as well. So it's all of that, right? But I always tell students, law students who I talk to, and younger students who say they want to be lawyers, and gosh knows, over the years, my things changed. The best thing I did was get a psychology degree. Most lawyers don't have a psychology degree. It's pre-law, it's liberal arts, it's a government, it might be like justice, but the psychology degree, the psychology of the doctors that I served, it is so stressful for a doctor to be sued for medical malpractice. It is so distressing. And, one of the things they call lawyers is counselor. And I took that very seriously. I wanted to counsel the doctor through the process. When I was a young attorney, my mentor was a man, and he would have me do those late night phone calls when they call at 2:00 in the morning, freaking out about the trial. And I tapped into my psychology degree. Certainly knowing about, government would not have helped me in that moment. So it's a huge...
It makes so much sense for lawyers to get a psychology degree. It just makes sense. You're trying to persuade every day. You're communicating with people every day. You're trying to prove your point. It just I feel like the law degree should just be a psychology degree. Like it should be.
It's so important. You need to know the law, and you do in law school learn a certain way to think. But also, I think that if you can't, the way that you learn to think is very logical, very black and white, very looking at the risks. And if you don't have, I also have been obsessed with self-help, personal development since I was 8 years old and started reading. If you don't have something like that to counter this black and white risk, and also good and bad, good guy, bad guy, enemy, like that person's my enemy. If you don't have something to counter that, it can really mess you up. You'll be a less effective lawyer, sure, but it can really mess you up in the head too.
You tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that with technology and everything that's going nowadays, I can, not that I can get the lawyer's job done through technology, but I feel like being a lawyer is kind of being like a robot. But with that psychology degree added to it, now you're providing that value that a technology cannot provide. Same way with like healthcare. Like, they say technology is going to take over a pharmacist's job. Yeah, it might do the background technician work of filling the medication, but they're not going to be able to have that patient connection interaction. That's your personality that comes through.
Absolutely. I can, again, ChatGPT. I can ask ChatGPT, give me all the case law, all the precedent on this issue when I go and argue it to the judge. But that's not going to influence the jury. They're not, and it's not going to teach the doctor how to talk to the jury about what they did. And like one of the things that I did a lot in the courtroom and I do a lot in my work now is, this is sort of going on left, but it'll bring us back. There's an idea in advertising that you have to repeat something. It used to be 7 times. That number keeps going up in order for people to hear you. And one of the things I recognize in the courtroom is if I just keep repeating things, it's going to annoy the jury. Like they're not going to be thrilled if I just keep saying the same things over and over. So I have some IP in my work that's 9X, 9W, 9 times 9 ways. How can I communicate this one point to the jury 9 times in 9 different ways? With a picture, with a medical record, with a witness, with a dog and pony show. And so that's a big part of what I would do in my cases. AI can help with that, but it can't come up with the creative ways that we're going to do that and exactly how that gets communicated to the jury. And I don't know that it ever will.
Did you ever try to read the body language and the tone of the other person's lawyer, and then you looked at them and you're like, I got this in the bag? Because you just were like, this person is just going to read a book. They're going to repeat what they read in a piece of paper. They've already studied this word for word, and they're not going to put that emotion behind it. And you're like, this is going to be an easy case.
No, we can get back to body language and tone of voice and how it did play in. That never happened. What I will tell you happened. And let's be honest, when you're in trial, I'll speak for myself. I have never been like, I've got this. It might be a case that I think I should win, but you're looking at the jury, they're on purpose not giving you any signals, right? They're like, sometimes they actually like are meaner, to give you meaner looks because they don't want to look like they're, so it's very hard to read. And you start to get in your head and you're like, I don't know if the jury gets this. One of my mentees just tried a case last week, and it sounded to me when she would come back at the end of the day and tell me about it, that she was winning. But when the jury was deliberating, she lost her ever-loving mind because you just don't know what's happening. I will tell you that the times that I felt most confident was when the lawyer on the other side was jerky. And by jerky, like jerky to me, sort of arrogant, flippant, unprepared. Like then I would be like, for better or worse, the jury's not going to like them. Now, one of the things that I teach people is being liked isn't as important as being believed. So certainly, if I could catch them in some major inconsistencies or what I would term to be lies, I felt pretty confident as well. But body language and tone of voice would not give me that same level of confidence.
So you mentioned there's not a lot of females in the field that you're in. Do you think it's easier for a female to convince a jury than a man? I feel like, from the outside perspective, I feel like I'll be able to be convinced a lot easier by a female than a man.
It's so interesting. I don't know about that. What I do know is, I think, again, you see what you believe.
Yeah.
And I believed it was an advantage from the day I started. I don't know. No one told me that. I just believed it was an advantage. So for me, it was an advantage. There are a lot of women who believe it's a disadvantage. And for them, it's a disadvantage. I see it all the time. But I do some teaching still to law school students. And I'm often brought in because I'm a woman. Like a lot of my male colleagues who teach classes will bring me in because they want a woman's perspective. And I say, things like tone of voice. So my tone of voice is different. Sometimes in my cases, there's 6 attorneys. If they're all men, and then I get up to speak, the jury is going to, well, sometimes they're sleeping. They can wake up, right? Because I sound different. And I do things differently. I look different. These cases get boring. So I think in that respect, it was an advantage. I will say there are some things like I'm a crier. I'm emotional, and I never cried in the courtroom because I think that may have changed. But for me, I felt like it would not be well received if I started crying during, say, my closing argument. My mentor was a 6'3", 220-pound ex-DEA agent. He would cry sometimes. Like I'm not like it wasn't an act. It just you get emotional. Plus you're so tired. And the jury loved it because they didn't think it was put on, right? And they were like, so I do think that there are some things that you can take advantage of your differences and your natural personality traits to the benefit. So I always saw it as a benefit, and it always was.
How do you pick your cases? And you were very good at what you did. So you were, the demand was high, and how many people wanted to have you on their side? Do you do like how do you cross people out? Say no, not this one, next one.
Well, so this is very interesting. On my side, we don't get to.
Oh.
We are assigned our cases from an insurance company. So on let's go way back to how this starts. Patient's injured. Patient thinks someone says to the patient, like a family member, it looks like you have a lawsuit. Somebody messed up. Sometimes the doctor will say that, another doctor. That patient then goes to an attorney. Those attorneys pick their cases. They'll look at a case, and I can tell you how they do it in general. I haven't done it myself, but I am friendly with enough of these people. They look at damages. If there's a high damages, because they have to put a lot of money into these cases. These cases aren't cheap. They call them a king's game because they have to hire experts. So they pick the cases based on damages, based on how clear it is that there's actually negligence, based on, to some degree, how well the patient's going to represent. But really, it's damages. Like everything else they can play with. On my side, so now the doctor's been sued. The doctor needs a lawyer. The doctor calls their insurance company, and their insurance company says, give it. And I was lucky too, because I had really good relationships with doctors. So they would say, it has to be Heather. But whether the doctor said it or the insurance company said it, it's give it to Heather. And now Heather has no choice. Heather's got to try.
So you can't turn it down?
No, well, I mean, I guess theoretically you could, but if you turn it down from an insurance company or a doctor, we had repeat business. So if I tell an insurance company, I'm not taking the cases I don't like, they're not sending me any cases. Wow. And also, and then you might not like the next 5 cases that come in. I've never known a defense attorney to turn down a case. I mean, unless it was perfect.
Yeah. It makes sense why you do what you do now. That all makes sense because you kind of had to just take what you get, and it's like you had to prep how you prep. It's all connecting now, the way your personality and how you take care of things, because you really didn't have a choice for 20 plus years on what comes across your table.
Well, no. And I think that, so there's that, right? That got old, but also it made me really good at a lot of things. It made me really good at building belief, and it made me really good. One of the things that I will tell you, and I talk about this all the time in my keynotes and in my work now with my clients, you can't prove something unless you believe it. So if I got a case that I didn't like, and I'm putting that in quotes, so say I got a case and I looked at it and I said, gosh, it looks to me like the medical providers messed up. Or a lot of times the system broke down. Like it looks to me like we have a problem. And then I wouldn't just go with that. I'd talk to the doctors. I'd talk to the nurses. I'd hire experts to explain things to me to make sure I wasn't just jumping to conclusions. And if after that process, I still felt that way, then I would talk to the insurance company, and I would talk to the doctors, and I would talk to the nurses, and I would say, this case is not defensible by saying we didn't make a mistake. We can say the mistake didn't cause the damages. We can say it's not worth $100 million. It's worth, less than a quarter of that. So there are things that I do believe about this case that we can argue and we can prove. But I would not, and then this never happened to me because after I would have that conversation, part of my job then is persuading those people, right? It's like the first line of persuasion, but they would always agree. But if they didn't agree, then you might say that I'm not the lawyer for you.
Okay.
I never had to do that.
At what point did you know you were good at persuading? Was there a certain person that you persuaded that kind of like was like, oh, I think I can do this. I think I found out how to do it.
I think that I had my psychology degree background. I had my law background. I started working at my firm while I was still in law school, and I would shadow my mentor. And so, but I was also cocky and young, and I was like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, And when we would settle cases, I would sometimes be like, we could have tried that case, we could have won that case, and I would be like, dukes up, ready to go. It's a lot easier to do that when you're not the one standing in front of the jury taking the verdict. And then when I tried my first case, the high of that win is something that's very hard to replicate. And it's this sense that I can do this. I can take, for me, it was 12 people, all different backgrounds, all different life experiences, and I can persuade them to see things the way that I see them. I can build their belief that way. And then every time that you try a case, you win, especially. But even if you lose, you start to say, like, I'm pretty good at this. And then it took me much longer to recognize how much that applied outside of the courtroom, how much that applied, in settlements. I would get the mediator to see things from my perspective. And then in life outside of the courtroom, whether it was with audiences or in persuading people to donate money to a cause, and just in, like, as a managing a partner at the law firm, to get people to do things that we as leaders wanted them to do, to make change. That's a big part of my work now, is going into organizations and teaching people how to advocate for change. And so you start to recognize that, it was hard in the courtroom. It's a whole lot easier outside of the courtroom because I can actually ask people questions and I can get feedback and I can adjust. And so, but it all started, that first win is a high like nothing you can imagine.
I can imagine for sure. As a pharmacist, I feel like I have to ask you this. I feel like you'd be the perfect person to ask. As pharmacists, throughout school, we advocate for the profession a lot. That's what they push us to do. And one of the big things they advocate us to do is for provider status. As pharmacists don't have provider status in Florida. And that's what they push us to do a lot. It's getting better, but I personally feel like it's hasn't gone there. It keeps going in circles. If someone came to you as a pharmacist, as an organization, like let's say APHA, American Pharmacists Association, is like, Heather, can you help us advocate for pharmacists fighting for provider status? Where would you start? And what would be the first questions you want to ask before you start that journey?
The first question I would ask you, Nima, and you can answer this question: who's your jury? Who do you have to persuade to get provider status? Your ultimate jury is the politicians in
It's
Tallahassee.
the politicians.
Well, we're not there yet. First, we've got to get to whose support do you need? And it sounds like
the patients.
You need the support of patients.
I think personally, I think that's where it starts. Because if patients don't still recognize what pharmacists do on a daily basis, like if I was to ask a random person on the street, what do you think a pharmacist does? They probably wouldn't be able to answer. Or if they do answer, it's probably not the right answer. They'd be like, oh, they fill medications, put it in a bottle, slap a label on it, and give it to someone. That's not what pharmacists do. So I think we're trying to jump ahead of we're skipping steps. Instead of trying to get the patients on board to really understand the average person, because the politicians are the average person, right? They're not pharmacists, they're not physicians, they're not nurses. They never interact with pharmacists besides maybe picking up their prescription.
Yeah.
So they're the average Joe. The average Joe doesn't know what a pharmacist is. So when you go into that office of whoever it is in Tallahassee, you have to start explaining to them what a pharmacist does and why they deserve to have provider status.
What you really want to do, and the reason I asked about who's your jury is it's not about why you deserve to have provider status. It's how it can help them if you have provider status. Ultimately, you've got to see it from their perspective. Who's your jury and what's their perspective? So let's go to the AMA because we can speak to that. How does it help doctors if pharmacists have provider status? I don't know the answer to that question, but you shook your head like that doesn't. I bet there's a creative way that it does.
Oh, 100% it does. Okay. And there's a lot of physicians so there's two different sides of pharmacy. There's the retail setting, CVS, Walgreens, whatsoever. Yeah. And then there's the inpatient side, which is the hospital setting so I feel like in the hospital setting, the physicians see the value of pharmacists big time. And the outside is a little bit more different. I'm not saying that they don't, but it's probably, if you put a percentage on it, there's probably a higher percentage of doctors that work in a hospital setting recognizing the value of pharmacists than the outside setting.
And that's what you want to do. You want to speak to the doctors and have them help you lobby. I mean, the other part of it is that medical providers are terrible at lobbying because you guys are busy and you have other things going on. But then you need to think about the government and and I don't know the answer to this, it would take research and time, but we could certainly do it. I'm happy to work with the APHA and talk about this. But it's, how does it serve the politicians, the public, the people they serve? And you're right to think about the patients, because ultimately, if we think about politicians, they just want to keep their constituents happy. They want to get re-elected. And so you've got to go back to, how does it serve the patients? What's the patient's pain that's not being solved? Are they frustrated because they're not getting the medications approved more quickly? Is that something that could be solved if the pharmacists were providers? Like, you really need to, it's all about, I have in my work now, I have what I call a belief triangle. And very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, that believe in you, but the foundation of a belief triangle is they have to believe that you can help them. So for every one of your juries, how does pharmacists becoming providers help the patients? How does pharmacists becoming providers help the AMA? How does pharmacists becoming providers help that one politician that you need to vote that way? And that's seeing that perspective and then speaking to that perspective is how you win.
I personally have not been involved in advocating in Tallahassee, so this is just coming from an outside point of view, even though I'm a pharmacist. So if anyone's watching him, they take it the wrong way. I think there's a lot of me talk. It may be in these, and it's like trying to convince the value of pharmacists rather than what you just said. Trying to say how my value is going to help you.
Always. And we all do it. It's the way our brains work. It's the way we're raised. It's about like I do one-on-one coaching, teaching people how to get jobs or raises or promotions or investment. And it's like, well, you should give me this because I'm really good and I've worked hard and I want to buy a house. And I'm like, who cares? They don't care. How does what you do impact their life, solve their problem, ease their pain? Because that's how you win. You don't win by saying, I'm really good at what I do. Big deal. How does it impact my life? Because I want to pay you more if you make my life easier, less painful, or more fun. So give me some of the ways that you can do that, and you're going to get so many more things.
Yeah. I have two more questions, if you don't mind. If we're running out of time, please stop me. I don't want to interrupt your schedule of what you have coming on. First of all, before I ask the questions, you need to come speak to the pharmacy schools down here. And I feel like we pharmacists need an outside perspective to kind of open their eyes. I feel like they're a lot of introverts, and there's not a lot of pharmacists that have a podcast that would want to talk to people. So I think seeing the things you talk about in your perspective would open the eyes of the students a lot. And that's who's going to change the future of the pharmacy.
Anyone listening, you want me to come speak to your students? I'm in. Just give me a call.
Two questions. Again, cut me off, please, if I know we're getting around close to the hour mark. What's one of the most unexpected challenges you face in your career?
So I ended up in the emergency room during one of my trials because I was having an allergic reaction to my own stress hormones. And that was a host of things led into that. But the challenge of it is I have a lot of both kinds of empathy. And so when my doctors were sued, I felt their pain. I also really worked hard to see the case from their perspective and to see the things that went on from their perspective. But in that particular case, it was a young female physician. So I had even more, studies show we have more empathy for people who look like us. And she had told me that if we lost the case, she was going to lose her job. And immediately my lips started swelling up and I was having this allergic reaction. And so the challenge was, and I don't know that I ever did it well. I continued to practice law for a number of years after that. But the challenge was to do that less and still be as good. And that's a challenge that I tried to manage for years. And then ultimately I stepped away because I want to feel what my people feel. And I want to see the world from their perspective. And it's a lot easier when there isn't as much on the line. Wow.
One last question. I love this question. I like to ask everyone. And I don't know how if you've heard me ask this question, but I feel like, I don't know, I feel like you know what's coming. But if I were to go back to high school and ask your favorite teacher and your best friend, best buddy, who was Heather, what would they say?
I was very different in high school, but I think that they would say she's kind. She's kind to everyone. And she drives because she doesn't drink. Back then,
I wasn't expecting that though. Right? You knew what you were doing. You knew what you were doing. I was at the edge of my seat.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was in high school, this is going off in a bit of a tangent, and I do have someone waiting for me. But I will say, when I was in high school, I weighed about 100 pounds more than I do now, and I am so grateful for that because as someone who was sort of on the outside of some things, didn't go to prom and that kind of thing, it made me kinder. It made me really good at seeing things from others' perspective. I was not the most powerful girl in high school, in that power play of high school. And so I was trained very much to what are other people thinking? What are other people seeing? And that could be harmful too. I mean, that's a whole other podcast. But I think that it made me more kind. I think it made me more empathetic. I think it made me more patient. And then back then I was afraid of my parents' wrath if I came home drinking. So I would always drive everyone wherever they wanted to go.
Awesome, Heather. I really appreciate it. I know you got to go. Thank you so much for your time and spending it with me. I enjoyed it much. I think your story, I could spend 3 more hours. I would love to have you back on and steep into the advocacy parts, but I really wanted to just learn a lot more about the law and the 20 years of experience that you've had. I think a lot of people can get a lot of value from that. So I really appreciate it.
It was truly my pleasure. I would be happy to come back on and talk about the other work. And thank you for having me. And thank you for the work you did in preparation. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone that was watching.